I'm Robert Leckie, Director of Spike Island and the curator of Ways of Attaching, the first institutional solo exhibition by Rosemary Mayer in the UK. The title Ways of Attaching refers to this interest in history, and specifically the history of women, and thinking about how expressions of affinity and attachment can be drawn across generations, but also to the very practical ways in which Mayer made her work. So there's often kind of fabric that's draped, tied and knotted, or even imagined, these kind of imagined constructions that you see elsewhere in the show. So we really wanted to kind of draw out this double meaning of attachment in the title. Passages is an elaborate handmade artist book that Mayer made in 1975, and it documents her only trip to Europe. She travelled to France, Italy, Germany and the UK, and she writes in this beautiful calligraphic hand about the art and architecture that she saw. It also incorporates postcards, watercolours, drawings that she made, and reflections on the trip. I think it's a really useful introduction to her work because it really gives a very broad and kind of open indication of this interest in art history, the history of women, biography as a means of storytelling, and also this idea of affinity and attachment across history, across time and across place. Mayer was one of the founder members of AIR, which was the first women-led artist co-op set up in New York City in the early 1970s. In her first solo exhibition there, which took place in 1973, she presented a series of large-scale fabric sculptures, and 3 of those works are on display here at Spike Island. They're all named after different historical or mythological women. So you have Galla Placidia, which is named after a region of the Western Roman Empire, Hypsipyle, named for the mythological queen of Lemnos in ancient Greece, and the Catherines, which is named after all of the women throughout history called Catherine. There's also a whole bunch of documentation of works that were either lost, never made, ephemeral, or impossible to make. So you have really interesting examples of the abstract painting that Rosemary Mayer was making during her studies before the kind of painting jumped off the canvas and she became more interested in the draping of fabrics and thinking about three-dimensionality. Or you also have a series of sculpture drawings that Mayer sometimes referred to as impossible drawings or impossible sculptures, that in crayon or marker render different fabric constructions on the page that would have been impossible to recreate, or at least very difficult to recreate in space. In the later 1970s, Mayer made a series of works called temporary monuments, where she gravitated away from the gallery space as a site for experiencing art and began to think about making work in public space. So these works also were made with ephemeral materials like snow or weather balloons, and they would celebrate or memorialize specific moments in time, whether it's the passing of the seasons or a specific moment which had a kind of personal relevance to Mayer and her life. Scarecrow is a really interesting work that kind of sits in between various series. So the temporary monuments on the one hand, but also the fabric sculptures and the impossible drawings, because it exists in the gallery as a maquette, but it was actually imagined to be produced on a much, much larger scale in a field in upstate New York. There are also significant changes as her practice developed over the years. So you switch from the kind of boldness and celebratory nature and extravagance of, for example, the fabric sculptures, to these works that still demonstrate an interest in classical history, like vessels, but are also much, much smaller in scale, and speak to Mayer also thinking much more about her own kind of feelings and interiority, and also her changing situation as an artist. In putting together the show, it's been really interesting to think through Mayer's relatively promiscuous approach to forms and materials, but also how she's constantly intertwining personal interests and relationships with natural cycles and also the arc of history.